Let's start by cutting out all the elements from the fabric. Fold the fabric in half along the selvage. Arrange the elements so that the line drawn on it is parallel to the selvage. To be sure, measure the distances from selvage to different points on the line. Pin all elements and cut them out. Attach interfacing. Areas that should be interfaced are marked in gray. Of course, it all depends on the fabric. If you choose very stretchy and loose fabric, you can attach interfacing to all areas. For large areas like front and front facing, use kneaded fusible interfacing and standard non-woven fusible interfacing for the rest. Let's start with preparing the pockets. Trace the pockets from the pattern on both sides of the skirt. Fold the pocket well in half. Attach it to the pocket bag, sewing at the edge. Mark the seam allowances on both pieces of the pocket bag. Place the elements of the pockets on the right side of the skirt so that the lines match. Fasten with pins and sew. Make sure to start and finish sewing exactly at the same spot on either line. Cut the fabric as shown in the picture. When cutting at an angle, be careful not to cut the seams. Cut as close as possible. Turn the elements inside out. Fasten the work with pins, stretching it slightly to the side so that it lies flat and even. Sew in the marked line. Cut off the excess lining and close the pocket. Sew the rest of the skirt and iron all the seams. Now let's move on to sewing the upper part of the coat. Sew the back, side back and side front together. Start pinning from the bottom until you reach the curve, then pin the piece at the top and spread the fabric between the pins. When sewing a princess cut, a piece of seam allowance must stick out on one side and its width should be the value of the seam allowance. Iron all seams and connect the upper part to the skirt. The next step is sewing bound buttonholes. Prepare a 2 by 40 cm wide strip. Fold it in half, sew it narrowly at the edge and divide it into 8 parts 1 by 5 cm long. Transfer the buttonholes and button areas from the pattern onto the fabric using threads. Mark the place for the buttonhole. Sew on the machine to get a basting stitch. Mark half the buttonhole on the right side of the fabric. Mark half centimeter from the folded side of the welt and just like with the pockets, place the elements so that the lines match. Make sure to start and finish sewing exactly at the same spot on either line. Check from the wrong side that the stitch does not go beyond the basting line and correct if necessary. Before cutting, check that the distance between the stitches is equal. Secure the ends. Cut open the buttonhole. Be careful not to cut the seams. Cut as close as possible. Turn the welt to the wrong side. Sew in the marked lines. When the buttonholes are finished, attach the fronts to the rest of the coat. Now let's move on to sewing the collar. Fold the fronts right sides together and sew the marked line. Iron the seams. Cut out small pieces from the seam allowances at the sewing point to reduce bulk. Place the front and back shoulder lines right sides together, pin and sew. Pin the center of the collar and the center of the back together. Place the seam allowances in opposite directions so that they do not move when sewing. Pin the other arm. Start sewing from the shoulder. Sew to the line where the seam of the collar and arm should meet. Cut the fabric between the lines all the way to the needle. Cut only the front, not the back. Place the fabric evenly and sew to the center of the back. Repeat it on the other side. Start sewing from the shoulder all the way to the seam in the center back. Remember to iron the seams. Now let's sew the facing. The process is similar to sewing a collar. Iron all the seams and attach the facing to the coat. Now let's move on to sewing sleeves. Place the apple sleeve and undersleeve right sides together, pin and sew. The situation here is similar to a princess cut. There must be a small triangle sticking out. Note that one side of the sleeve is a bit longer. Sew the longer part on the feed dog, it helps to feed the fabric. Once again, remember to iron all the seams. Sew the sleeve head into the sleeve cap so that it forms nicely. If you can't find it in a store, you can make it yourself from cotton batting. Attach it at the edge. Pin sleeve to armhole matching notches. I usually sew on the armhole side, which makes it easier to feed the fabric and make a straight stitch. Now is a good time to attach the belt loops. Place the belt loop with the right side to the right side of the coat and sew it on. Fold the other side of loop underneath and top stitch. The belt will be 3.5 cm wide, so the loop should be 4 to 4.5 cm. Top stitch both ends of the loop. Attach as many loops as you want and check that they are all equal. If everything is fine, you can cut off the excess fabric. Because my fabric is very thick, I did not turn the loops inside out, only press them properly. Now let's go back to the bound buttonholes. We have to make holes in the facing so that the buttons can be fastened. Pin the facing to the front of the coat and use pins to mark the buttonholes on the facing. Stick pins in the corners of the buttonhole. Now you can easily mark the place for the buttonhole on the facing. Once you've marked the buttonholes on the facing, prepare 4 pieces of lining with rectangles drawn. The buttonholes on the front are 3 by 1 cm, so those on the facing should be a little smaller to cover the seams nicely. Arrange the elements so that the rectangles drawn on the lining are in the middle of those marked on the facing and sew it on. Cut open the holes. Turn the lining inside out and baste it with thread. Fasten the front and facing. Finish the buttonhole with a blind stitch by hand. Remove the basting stitching and the buttonhole is finished. Now, if you wish, you can sew a decorative piping to the facing. Before sewing the lining, attach all the buttons. Mark the top of the darts with a thread and sew them. Now sew the pleats in the middle of the bag. Use white stitch, later we will remove the threads. Form a block pleats and press it. Sew the sleeves. Leave a hole about 30 cm in one sleeve. Pin the sleeve to the armpit. Pin to the notches on the armpit. Fold the excess fabric into a pleat and attach to the notch on the arm. Attach the lining to the coat. Use the narrow foot to sew close to the piping. Fold the facing and front right sides together. Fasten with pins. Mark the seam allowance starting from the edge, in this pattern 2 cm. Mark 1 cm on the seam connecting the lining and facing. Connect these 2 points with a smooth line and sew. Turn inside out and baste the bottom of the coat. Check that the entire bottom of the skirt is nice and even and turn the corner inside out again. Trim the excess fabric and form a corner. Attach the lining to the coat on the shoulder, which prevents the lining from slipping through the bottom of the sleeve. Prepare 2 strips of the lining about 3 by 5 cm long. Sew one side to the shoulder seam of the coat and the other side to the shoulder seam of the lining. Now baste the lining to the bottom of the coat. Pin it loosely so that the lining does not drag the coat. After fastening, it's a good idea to try the coat on or hang it on the mannequin and check that nothing is stretched. Turn the coat inside out using the hole in the sleeve lining. Sew the lining to the hem. Turn inside out and check that the lining is not sticking out or pulling anywhere. Turn inside out again and sew the hem. You can do it by hand or with the blind stitch on the sewing machine. Iron the hem of the sleeve 2 cm and pin the lining as it should look like in the end. Only one pin is enough. Turn inside out. Remove this one pin and you can easily attach the lining to the sleeve hem. Sew the hem of the sleeve. Close the hole in the sleeve. Top stitch the front of the coat. And finally the belt. Transfer the stitching lines from the pattern to the fabric. Fold the right sides together and sew the rounded end of the belt. Fasten both sides of the belt with pins so that nothing moves while sewing. Sew one side of the belt. Sew the other end of the belt. Do not sew at right angles. Instead, make 1 or 2 stitches at a 45-degree angle. The corners will look better. Trim off excess fabric. turn the tips inside out. On the arc, cut perpendicular to the seams and trim off the excess fabric. Iron the seams. Because the fabric is thick, it would be hard to sew the whole belt and turn it over, so I just fold the seam allowances, baste them and top stitch. Attach the eyelet about 8 cm from the edge. Put the clasp through the eyelet and sew the belt in the seams.